So good evening, dear members of the jury, dear friends, family, colleagues. I'm very, very happy to present to you in the next 45 minutes the things that I've been working on in the last 4 to 5 years. I think I've been talking to most of you already about some of the things that I've done, but now today it's really the time to show you also with some pictures and some nice graphs what I've actually been doing. And I will maybe start with the title. It's quite a big one. I just need to change something here. Structural behavior and safety of restrained pre-stressed concrete hollow core slabs in relation to robustness and fire design. So that's quite a mouthful, and to break it down in a bit smaller pieces, I've selected some of the few words, and I will then briefly, piece by piece, explain the title a little bit more. So first of all, hollow core slabs. I think that word almost any one of you have already heard in the last 4 to 5 years. But what are they actually? I will start with explaining with a picture. I think it's always nice to have a picture to explain something. These are concrete hollow core slabs. Basically, they're concrete floor elements, and they are hollow. They have these longitudinal voids inside of them, and that's why we call them hollow core slabs. And we typically use them for flooring. Actually, if you look up right now, the ceiling above you, these concrete members are actually hollow core slabs. That was also one of the reasons I wanted to have this room, because it's a nice example. And these are slabs which are just from the factory waiting to be installed. And if you move them to the factory, when they are installed, it looks more like this. So you can make very large floors with them, and it's a very fast way of working. Why study hollow core slabs, you might ask? I mean, 4 or 5 years. Hollow core slabs have many advantages compared to other flooring products, and one of them is that they have a very efficient design. We have these hollow cores, as we call them, which are just voids of air. So we have a reduced self-weight, and because of that, they're more efficient compared to a solid slab. Secondly, they can be produced in a very automated way. Basically, they are produced in large production halls, and we have these machines which run along a track, and they produce them almost automatically, and there's very little human labor involved. Next, you can also, once the concrete has hardened, move them immediately to the construction sites, put them down, and there's no need for temporary supports. Basically, they can function as a load-bearing member straight away. And also, it allows to make spans up to 80 meters. So, for example, here we have a nice large room. These members allow for that because you can make very large spaces, for example, for a parking garage or an industrial building. So many advantages, and that's also a reason why they're very popular. Currently, it's an estimate from 2013. There's more than 1 billion square meters installed in the world right now. And 1 billion is a very big number. So to put that a bit in perspective, 1 billion square meters is approximately 6.5 times the area of Ghent. So from here in Zwijndrecht all the way to the north, the northern tip of the harbor. So you have to imagine entire Ghent covered in hollow core slabs, 6 layers tall, and then half of it once again. Another term in the title is pre-stressed concrete. So we're talking about concrete slabs, but it's a special type of concrete because it's pre-stressed. I can explain pre-stressing with 3 easy pictures. So unlike regular concrete, where you put the steel rebars in the formwork and then you cast concrete on top of it, the first step you need to do in pre-stressing concrete is actually pre-stressing the steel. So we basically apply tension to it, we clamp it, and then in the next step we can cast concrete over it, and then we wait for the concrete to actually harden, and only then we cut the strands, and then basically the tension that was in the steel is being transferred to the concrete member, and it's pre-stressed basically. So the hollow core slabs that I'm discussing in the thesis are pre-stressed, they're not regular concrete. And next term in the title is robustness. And robustness is basically the field of expertise of Robbie Caspedo, one of my supervisors, actually one of the many expertises. And basically, I can say that. And basically, if you open the textbook about robustness, you will almost always see this picture because it's the most famous example of a structure that was not very robust. Basically, what happens with this one, there was an explosion in one of the rooms at the top floor, and consequently, all the floors underneath, you see the entire corner is missing, all the rooms underneath collapsed as well. So this is basically what we mean is you have a disproportionate damage following a local damage event. The final term I also want to discuss is fire. I think this one is for everyone easy to grasp, but I want to highlight it anyway. Fire can be a very severe situation to a building, both from a structural point of view, but also for the people who are in the building, maybe even more. And it's also important to mention that as a structural engineer, fire can also be a very severe event to a structure. It can cause damage, like the damage that you see here, but it can also deform members because of the heating. They lose their strength and it might lead to partial or complete collapse of a structure. And then lastly, we have structural behavior. I'm a structural engineer, so that's also what I'm trying to study. And here is one important thing that I want to highlight that was important for the research. You have on the left, you have more like a theoretical means of looking at concrete members. Typically, when we do calculation, we look at one single member and we try to calculate the capacity and try to design them in an efficient way. But then actually, once we install them in a building, they're no longer in this theoretical state where we just have two supports. They're actually part of a bigger structure. And there's members surrounding it. There's columns, there's floors, there's beams. And so the boundary conditions in a real structure are completely different or very different from the ones that we have in theory or in a lab test. And the same is also true for a fire. Typically, when we do a fire test, we put them on top of a furnace. And then we see and we evaluate what is the fire resistance. But if we look at the real structure, a floor slab is part of a real structure, will also be surrounded by other members. And typically, you know that when something gets hot, it wants to expand. And when it's part of a bigger structure, the expansion will be restrained by the surrounding members. So again, big difference between theory and what happens in practice. If we talk about members, and especially members that are restrained at the edges, there is one phenomenon that always pops up in literature, and that is called membrane action. And to explain membrane action very briefly, basically, if you have a beam like the one that you see right now, which is simply supported, then if we apply a load to that, we can get a curve a bit like the one that you see on the left. So on the horizontal axis, we have the displacement, and the vertical axis, we have the load. And initially, we have a linear relationship between the displacement and the load, and at some point, we reach a plateau, and that corresponds to the capacity of the member. But now, if we change this setup to one where the displacements at the sides are restrained, we get a different picture. Basically, what can happen is we apply the loads, and because the member wants to expand at the sides, we get the phenomenon which is called compressive membrane action. Compressive membrane action, basically, or sometimes also called arching action, is a phenomenon in which we get some kind of a compression arch between the supports. And as you know from even the old structures that date all the way back to the medieval times and before, an arch is a very stable structure. And this arch can actually increase the capacity of the member beyond the one that we have if we assume simple supports. And that's why you get the blue curve. You see that the capacity is much, much higher. If we load the slab even further, we can also go into a phenomenon which is called tensile membrane action. In that case, the capacity can also increase, but that is more because the reinforcement is working as some kind of a net. I will not discuss that one because in hollow core slabs it doesn't happen very often. It's mainly compressive membrane action that is the most important phenomenon. And that brings me to the main research questions of my PhD. So again, we have the graph with the green and the blue curve, and I'm most interested in how big is the difference between these curves. Because if the distance is very small, it's not really worth investigating. But if it's very big, it can be very useful because we can make structures much, much safer. And so the main questions are, can compressive membrane action develop in hollow core slabs? That was the first question, because we have these concrete members, but they have very large openings in them. So maybe these openings prevent any formation of compressive membrane action. We don't know. If that's the case, how large is this additional capacity? And also, can we use this effect, and is it beneficial in case of a fire? So that's basically the introduction. And then my PhD itself basically consists of 3 parts, which I will now discuss in more detail. And the first part, conveniently named Part A, deals about restrained hollow core slabs at ambient temperature. Fire part will come later. This first part contains of 3 chapters, chapter 3, 4, and 5 in the book. And the first one is an experimental campaign, and I will start with that one. So because we wanted to test to what extent compressive membrane action can occur in concrete hollow core slabs, we developed a test campaign, or we developed a test setup, a completely new one. It does not exist yet. And I will quickly run you through it. So first of all, what you see here, the green part is the slab itself. Of course, that's the one that we want to test. Then we have 2 supports, 8.4 meters apart, so quite a big span, which is representative for a real floor. And then that's the interesting part, because we want to restrain the outward displacements. We built this very particular setup that at both sides we have these 2 very heavy concrete blocks, which are anchored to the lab floor. And these prevent basically the outer displacement of the slab. Then additionally, we have also 2 steel rods at both ends, which also prevents the rotation of the slab. And then lastly, because we want to test the capacity, we have to apply the loads. And for that, we use 2 load checks, which can, in a very controlled manner, increase the load in the slab. And then we test it until it fails. And then we also did a third test because we want to see what's the difference between a slab with restraints and a one without. So we also did an unrestrained test as some kind of a reference. In total, we did 3 tests. So 2 with the restraint setup, 2 times exactly the same test. And then a third one, which was the reference test. And I will now show you a video of the first test. What you see right now is basically a time lapse of the first test. In reality, it was almost 2 hours, but in this video, it's compressed all the way down to 1 minute. And on the top right, you can see basically the relation between the loads and the displacement throughout the test. As you can see, maybe also, I don't know if the lighting isn't too harsh. It was in full COVID, everyone was wearing a mask. Luckily, we don't have to do that anymore. I hope this is a bit better. And as you can see, the load keeps on increasing and increasing. And eventually, we get a failure. You see that they're almost at the top right of the graph, so it cannot be long anymore. And there we have it. This is a slow motion of the failure. So as you can see, it was quite an abrupt failure, and we were very happy that no one was near the slab at the moment that this occurred. So the graph on the top right, I will break it down for you in a little bit more steps. So again, we have a relation between the loads and the displacement. And initially, we have a linear relationship. So basically, we increase the load a bit, and also the deflections increase in the same amount. And then at around 70 kilonewtons, we had the first cracks at the top surface. And that's basically because we were restraining the ends against rotation. You can also see the crack pattern visualized here at the bottom. And then we increase the load further. And then we also get cracks at the bottom surface. Again, this was expected, but yeah. And then after increasing the load quite a bit more, we had a rupture of the reinforcement at the top of the slab, again, at these locations at the supports. And then eventually, at 298 kilonewtons, we reached the ultimate capacity. And I will show you the failure in real time. You will see it was very sudden and very abrupt. So yeah, that was the first test. It was a very interesting day for me. I learned a lot from that. Although it took also a few days after to post-process everything, but it was very happy with the results. Then we did a second test, exactly the same setup, and there you see the result in the green curve. Overall, the behavior was very similar, except for the capacity that we reached in the end was a bit lower. And again, we had a failure, a shear failure, which is this red crack that you see that starts at the support and goes diagonally up to the load application point. That brings us to the third test, which is the reference. And for that, again, I have a time lapse. So again, we see at the beginning, we have a linear relationship between the displacements and the loads. And then at some points, the member starts cracking at the bottom, and there's a very clear shift in the angle of the curve. It becomes much flatter. And then at some point, we'll also reach a plateau. You can already see now in the figure that the deflections are getting very, very large. For me, it was quite interesting to see that such a solid and big member can deflect so much without breaking. And then at a deflection of about 250 millimeters, we had to actually release the load from the member because we were reaching the ultimate displacement of the load jacks. But you can clearly see in the graph that we were reaching a plateau. So for us, that was an indication that we were very close to the ultimate capacity. Now I'll show you a video from the side where you can really see how much this member was actually deflecting without failing. This is solid concrete, so that's was for me quite interesting to see. Okay, so again, if we break down the curve, this one is a bit less complex. Basically, we reached the cracking load, and after that, the angle of the curve was much flatter, and we reached the plateau. And then we reached the limit of the jacks. And again, you see the cracking pattern at the bottom once again. So basically from this test campaign, we learned a few things. First of all, we were very happy because it was the first experimental proof that compressive membrane action can occur in concrete hollow core slabs. Secondly, if we look at the ultimate capacities that we achieved, we can say that the capacity that is achieved because of compressive membrane action is much, much higher compared to the reference case. So that's also interesting. And also an interesting result was the fact that the failure mode of these members can change depending on the restraints. In case of the restraint test, we had a shear failure, which was very abrupt. And in case of the unrestrained test, we didn't see a failure, but it was going towards a bending failure, which is much more ductile. So we can do many, many experiments, but as you can imagine, these are very expensive and time intense. And if we want to investigate other situations, a longer slab, different material properties, a different section, we could do more tests and spend years and years in the lab. But it's actually more efficient to try to develop some kind of a numerical model in the computer and try to simulate this behavior numerically. And that's why we also create a numerical model. So basically what we did is we take the same geometry from the tests and we model it in the computer with the finite element software. And by doing so in a few hours, we can test many, many cases and also draw conclusions from that, which is much more efficient than doing all these tests. But the first thing we need to do is to verify if our model is actually representing what reality does. And in that extent, basically, we have the figure here on the slide. So as you can see, for the unrestrained case, the blue curves, they're matching very well. And also for the green and the red one, overall, the correlation was quite well. There's some reason why they're not perfectly matching, but afterwards, we now also know why that's the reason. It has to do something with the concrete tensile strength. But overall, we were very happy with the correlation between the results. So that also means that we can use it to do some further parameter studies and to look at different cases and situations. Also, the model was able to predict very well the cracking pattern. So that was also for us an indication that the model is performing very well and that we can use it for other purposes. So, and then typically, if you read a scientific paper, one thing that you always see, or very often see, is a parameter study. And if you open the book, you will see many of these graphs. Maybe the first time you see it, it might look a bit strange, but I will explain it a little bit more. So first of all, on the y-axis, we have a parameter lambda, which is basically, it tells you how much the capacity of a restrained slab is higher than the unrestrained case. So basically, if you have a value of lambda equal to 0, for example, like the ones that you have here at the bottom, that means that for those cases, there's actually no additional capacity. For the other ones, where the color is not blue, but it goes to green and yellow, for example, the triangle all the way at the top, there's a case where actually the capacity lambda equals approximately 1.7. So that means that we have a 70% higher capacity than the unrestrained case. So for that one, actually, compressive membrane action enhances the capacity quite a bit. And then on the horizontal axis, we have two parameters, K and R. I've been playing with these for many times, but it's good that I explain them a bit. First K is the stiffness of the surrounding structure represented by action springs. So basically, depending on the members that are next to the member that we are studying, this can have a different stiffness, and the higher the stiffness, the higher the value of K. And the same is true for R, which is the rotational stiffness of the boundary conditions. And basically, the graph shows that if we have a combination of both rotational and actual stiffness, only then we get very high additional capacity due to compressive membrane action. What was also interesting to see is that depending on the combination of these parameters, we get different failure modes. So first of all, the ones here at the bottom were all failing in flexure, which is also what we saw in the reference test. So imagine very large deflections, and then eventually in the computer, they actually fail. We have these red spots here at the bottom, which indicate that the steel has ruptured. But if we look at cases with high restraints, actually we see a different failure mode. There we get a crushing failure. So in this case, the steel has not ruptured. There's no red elements there, but we see that the concrete at the top, somewhere around the middle, starts to crush. So basically, the concrete has not enough compressive strength to sustain all the loads that are acting on the member. And then lastly, at the very top, for the very high restraint cases, we get the shear failure, which is also the one that we observed in the experiments. So yeah, you can see that even in one graph, there's a lot of information, and the book is actually full of them. This is a bunch of these graphs for different span lengths. So at the top left, we have a relatively short member, and then at the bottom right, we have a relatively long one. And we see that In the short members, we get a very high additional capacity, easily up to 70% more. Whereas for the short members for the longer members, 12.8 meters, the additional capacity is only about 40% higher. And also the failure mode is all in flexion. So the span to depth ratio of these members is a very important parameter. And then lastly, these numerical models are very interesting because they allow us to study many parameters and also cracking patterns and failure modes. But still, one of these calculations can easily take up to several hours or even a day. So if we want to do an even faster calculation, we can try to develop some kind of analytical model. So basically trying to come up with a set of equations which allow us to basically, in a matter of a second, also have an idea of what is the capacity of such a member. And that's also what we did. So basically, we take the geometry and we take a very simplified, as shown on the slide. Basically, we get 3 linear parts and then 4 plastic hinges. And based on a model that was proposed by Park and Gamble in 2000, we adapted it a little bit. And we're also able to quantify what is the capacity of a restrained hollow core slab. Again, I ran many numerical simulations, and then I tried to compare them with the results from the analytical model. And as you can see, overall, we get a very good correlation. The closer the dots are to the dotted line, the better the correlation. And for almost all the cases, we had a very good correlation between the analytical model and the numerical model. Also, comparing the results against the experiments, we get an overall very nice correlation. So in the first column, we have the ultimate capacities that we achieved during the test. The second column are the capacities that we calculate with the model. And in the third column, we basically have the ratio of the two, and the closer to 1, the better. And they're also, all in all, very close to 1. So we were very satisfied with that result. So that was part A. Here's a very brief summary. The experimental campaign, herein we showed that compressive membrane action can actually occur in concrete hollow core slabs. Then we studied these results further with a numerical model, and then we also developed an analytical model, which is a very efficient way to predict the compressive membrane action capacity of these members. So that was part A. And then we go straight to part B. In part B, we basically increased the complexity. So we study the same phenomenon, but now we also added the complexity of a fire. And this chapter, or this part, is divided into 2 chapters. There's a very brief literature review, which I will cover in 1 or 2 slides, and then there's a more elaborate chapter on, again, a numerical model where we include the effects of a fire. So first of all, the literature. What I did as part of literature review was collect gather a database of 202 fire tests and try to see what was already done. And one of the things that popped up was the fact that many of these tests, I found more than 200, have been, basically all of them have been performed on slabs with a span smaller than 7.5 meters, basically because most laboratories don't have a test furnace that is bigger than that. But if you remember from the introduction, we can have hollow core slabs with spans up to 18 meters, and we don't really know we have some idea of what will happen, but it's never been tested before. And a second thing we also found is that is, again, in case of restraints, which I have been talking about in the introduction. There have been some tests on hollow core slabs with restraints, but most of the times the level of restraint is very small, and also there's not too many available. So especially for long slabs and slabs with restraints, we don't really know what's going to happen yet, and that was a reason to study it. So the main outcome of the literature review was we should investigate the fire response of restrained long span hollow core slabs. And that brings me straight to chapter 7, which is again a numerical investigation, but now including the effects of a fire. So if we want to study a concrete or any member and how it behaves in a fire, we typically do a 2-step analysis. First, we want to know what is the temperature inside the member and how is it changed to time. So for that, we do a heat transfer analysis, and then we use the data that we gather from the heat transfer analysis and use it as input for a mechanical analysis, where we can see how the member actually behaves in case of a fire. So this is an example of a heat transfer analysis. Again, we apply the heat. Typically, when there's a fire, the heat rises. So in such analysis, mostly we apply the heat from below. And you can see how the temperature increases from the bottom towards the top. And to put it more quantitatively, we also include a graph. So for example, the darkest curve corresponds points closest to the bottom surface. So these ones are heating up the fastest, and then the green curve is the one all the way at the top of the member, and that one heats up very, very slowly. If you would run the analysis longer, eventually it will also start to heat up, but it goes much slower than the concrete that is very close to the fire exposure. Secondly, we can also do a mechanical analysis. This is for an unrestrained slab. So basically, we just put it on top of the furnace and apply the heat from below, but it can freely expand. And then we see that for this particular case, we get the bending failure at approximately 116 minutes. We can also plot the deformations through time. So basically, on the horizontal axis, we have the time, and the vertical axis, we have the displacement, and we can see that slowly, because the member is starting to bend, the cracks are getting bigger and bigger, and eventually we get a failure. And in this case, we have a failure at a deflection of about 600 millimeters. So actually quite a big deflection before it fails. Then if we do the same analysis, but we apply some restraint at the edges, we get a different result. Again, we get some deflections, but they're already much smaller. And also the mode of failure is now much different than the previous one. Remember, the previous one, we had a failure at the center because the rebars were failing, but now because there is restraints, again, shear failure is appearing. And again, we see that also restraints can affect the behavior of hollow core slabs also in case of fire. And also, if I look at the displacement curves, we see that we get a higher fire resistance, so that's already interesting. It fails later. And also the deflection at failure is less. So a first conclusion can be that in case of restraints, the fire resistance can be severely altered. And to dig into that result a bit more, I present to you two cases. So a first case study is a hollow core slab with an 8-meter span. And for that one, we can run multiple analysis. So the first analysis is for the value k equal to 0. K equal to 0 means simply supported. So just a roller support left and right. But then we can run many more analyses. And then if you look at the curve on the right, each point that is seen here, if you project it down to the horizontal axis, for example, the first one, we have a fire resistance of 75 minutes, is also the point that you see here. And then the next one is the next one, and so on. So basically what we see is if we increase the restraints of the surrounding structure, so the stiffer the surrounding structure, the higher the fire resistance in this particular case. And also an interesting result is that at some point we shift from a bending failure towards a shear failure. So for this particular case, we can conclude restraint has a positive effect, similar to what I presented in the previous slides. But then in the second case, we get the completely opposite results. This is for a hollow core slab, which is much longer. And there we see actually that if we apply restraints, that the fire resistance can go down almost with 30 minutes. So, and I think this is a very important result because we usually don't really think about it, but for firefighters that have to enter a building and evacuate people, this is a very important finding because we should be aware that in some cases fire resistance might be significantly less than what we expect based on a simple calculation. So we can see two cases. In one case, restraints positive effects. In the other case, restraint can have a negative effect. And that's the summary of part B, basically. We first did the literature review, and then we did a quite extensive numerical investigation, where we found that the span-to-depth ratio and the boundary conditions can severely affect the fire resistance of the slabs that are now above your head. And that brings me to the last part, which is part C. And in part C, we did two additional investigations, building on what we learned in part A or B. And in chapter 8, we investigated the influence of connections, and in chapter 9, we investigated the influence of uncertainty. So first of all, influence of connections. The picture you see on the left are the boundary conditions that we used in the test. So there was a very special setup with these big anchorage blocks and a very heavy steel profile, the blue one that you see here. But of course, if you go and look on the construction site, the boundary conditions that we have in the real structure can be severely different. This is a picture from a real concrete hollow core floor before it's being finished with the final layer of concrete. And we see that at the edges of the members, there's no steel profiles or concrete blocks. There is just, for now, it's still open, but there is bars, and basically there will be a beam cast next to it. So it's a completely different situation, again, than the one that we tested in the lab. And because of that, we also want to investigate, do the conclusion that we had in part A still hold also in case of more detailed connections where we consider a beam rather than the steel profile. So that's again what we did. So it's basically this what I'm talking about. We have to check if this is also valid in other cases. So this is a schematic representation of the test setup where we had this artificial support. And basically what I did now is model a more detailed connection where we have an actual beam. And we want to see, do we get a similar result or not? And overall, I was very happy to see that this is indeed the case. So the green curve that you see at the bottom is the configuration that we used in the test. And the purple one at the top is one where we have a more detailed connection with actually an additional rebar over the connection. And we see that overall, the behavior is very similar. And moreover, actually, in case of this additional rebar, also the capacity is even a little bit higher. So that was, for us, a reason to conclude that compressive membrane action can also occur in case of hollow core slabs with more realistic connections. Yeah, that's already what's on the slide. And also the ultimate capacity, again, is relatively similar. That brings me to the last chapter, which is influence of uncertainty. Typically, as a civil engineer, we are faced with different types of uncertainties. For example, if you go on a construction site and you cast cubes, which are with concrete that comes straight from the cement truck, if you cast a cube in the morning or in the evening or the next day or the week after, you bring all the cubes to the lab and you test them after 28 days, the value will never be exactly the same. There is some uncertainty. And that's something that we can work with, but we should also be aware of it. The same is true for steel. If you test 10 steel rebars, they will not have exactly the same strength. There is also some uncertainty there. And especially also in pre-stressed concrete members, there's also uncertainty on the level of pre-stress. Moreover, the geometry can also not always be perfectly known. We are now building a house, Lisa and I, and Mason is not super precise, like centimeter precision, is more something in millimeter precision. That's also something that we should take into account. And then lastly, also the loads. As an architect, you cannot not yet know if someone will use a certain room as a bedroom or as a library. The loads can change also throughout the lifetime of structure. So also the loads are uncertain, and we should take into account all of these uncertainties. And typically, as a structural engineer, we can do that by doing probabilistic analyses. So what we do is we take probabilistic models for all the different variables that we want to take into account. So there's uncertainty in the concrete compressive strength, in the tensile strength, uncertainty in the rebars, uncertainty in the loads, and we can do we can use a sampling technique and come up with analyses which look like this. Basically, we take random values for each of these parameters, we put them in the model, and then we run it a few times, and then we get different results. And basically, if you remember the graph that I showed in chapter 4, we can also create graphs taking into account all these uncertainties. And again, if you look at the graph on the left, we have the value 0, 0, which is corresponding to a slab which is unrestrained. There we see that the points on the vertical axis are relatively close to each other, so the uncertainty there is relatively small. But if we increase the restraint stiffness, both in terms of the rotational stiffness or the actual stiffness, we see that the uncertainty increases quite a bit, especially if you look at the points where k and r are equal to 2. We see that the value of lambda ranges from 1.4 to 2.2, so there's a very, very big uncertainty. So the main conclusion is that increasing the restraint stiffness also increases the uncertainty on the ultimate capacity, taking into account restraint. We can do a similar analysis in case of fire. Then again, I showed you some graphs which show the displacement over time in case of fire, both for an unrestrained hollow core slab, which is the red curves, and the restrained ones, which are green and blue. And there again, we see if we plot them as distributions, we see that if we increase the restraint stiffness, also the uncertainty on the fire resistance increases quite a bit, especially if you look at the blue curve, we can see that the fire resistance is somewhere between 30 and 150. So there's a very, very large spread. So the conclusion from these analyses was that increasing restraint stiffness also increases uncertainty on the fire resistance. And that's then immediately also the summary of this last part C, the influence of connections, where we saw that compressive membrane action can occur in hollow core slabs with detailed connections. And when we studied the uncertainty, we also saw that restraint increases the uncertainty on both the capacity and the fire resistance quite a lot. And that brings me to the conclusions. So the conclusions from part A, I'm repeating myself a little bit. So first of all, we did an experimental campaign, and then we also verified the results from the campaign with analytical and numerical models. And what we saw is that compressive membrane action can lead to significant reserve capacity in concrete hollow core slabs, and it can also alter the failure mode. Secondly, in part B, we increased the complexity and we also looked at the case of fire. And there again, we saw that restraints can very strongly affect the fire resistance of these concrete hollow core slabs. And lastly, in part C, what I just told you about compressive membrane action can also occur in hollow core slabs with realistic connections. And if we take into account uncertainties, we see that if we increase the restraint stiffness, also the uncertainty on the capacity and the fire resistance increases. Thank you. This was my presentation. I'm very glad that I was able to show you what I did in the last 4 to 5 years, and I'm now ready to answer all of your questions.